Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Future of Jewish podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Hoffman. On this episode, I am joined by Aliza Kline, the co-founder and CEO of OneTable. Since 2014, OneTable has grown to a national organization in the United States that serves tens of thousands of young Jewish adults through peer-led Shabbat dinners. Enjoy my conversation with Aliza Kline. Aliza, thank you so much for joining me. It's really a pleasure. Why don't we start by you telling us more about your background, where you grew up, anything else that you think would be interesting for us to know?
Yeah, I mean, I'm endlessly interesting, Josh. So thanks for phrasing it that way. And it's pretty fun to meet you and be on this podcast. So thanks for the invitation as well. So I am a product of a dancer and a rabbi. I grew up mostly in Colorado Springs, and I think that the mixture of having grown up with very few other Jews around and with an artist who's a dancer who highly valued aesthetic, and a rabbi and Bible scholar who highly valued the potential for ritual connection and study. All of those things combined absolutely helped form who I am. I'm also a middle child, so we can analyze all of that together. But the other piece about my childhood that I think is relevant is that because it was Colorado Springs, Colorado, which at the time was a city of about 250,000 people and, maybe 1,000 Jews, that was so much of my identity. That's what made me separate and other from basically every other Coloradan that I got to know. I wore it, I think, with a certain level of comfort and pride. It was an expression. My name is Aliza, which is a Hebrew name. My brother is Avi. My sister is Shira. There were no other Coloradans with those names at the time. So it was a part of just how we navigated the world. And I felt like a little bit like an emissary in that sense too. Like we were the rabbi's family. Everybody kind of knew us in that way. But the mixture of the dancers coming in and out of our house all of the time meant there was just a fluidity in terms of the relationships that we had and engagement with the community, deeply within the Jewish community, and then well beyond. So I feel like those things have shaped me a lot. When I made my way to university, to Washington University in St. Louis, I chose it in part because the Jewish population was 35% Jewish. And I was like, holy cow, what is it like to be one of many? And in great part, there was some comfort in it, but I was also surprised at how many people I met who could kind of give a shit. Their being Jewish was not what made them different. It was not what made them separate. It didn't have automatically joyful associations as it did for me. And I hit my head against the wall briefly, and then I just said, well, screw it. I'll just get involved. I'll see if I can make it better. And I'm just one of those people. I've learned about myself throughout my career that there are types who are like, oh, this isn't good enough, and they walk away. And there's types who are like, oh, I could maybe make this better. At least I'm going to try. What do I have to lose? And that's been sort of dominant for me in finding new ways to bring my kind of skills in leadership and nonprofit management and integrating arts and ritual and hopefully bringing it at massive scale now in the Jewish community. That sort of drives me.
That's amazing, really amazing. And that's why I was super excited to talk to you, because I do find that there are a lot of people that look at different aspects of the Jewish world and for whatever reason don't see themselves in it and just decide to walk away. There's so many other options today, digital, virtual, in person. So it's one of those things where I think Judaism is competing with so many other things today that maybe in previous generations, it didn't compete with as much. I'm wondering, what was the first iteration of your sort of mindset of trying to make things better? Like, where did you start?
I mean, I did walk into Hillel, honestly, my freshman year with my roommate, who was from Arizona. So she had a fairly similar, like being in the minority kind of identity to me. I dragged her with me. She's, by the way, now a rabbi, so I take full responsibility. But I just remember going in and being very warmly welcomed. It was a very kind of Hamish place in the full sense of that word, which was not a word I used a whole lot growing up in Colorado, but I learned it. And also somewhat schlocky. And in particular, I had grown up in the reform movement and active in summer camps. That's where my dad was ordained. And the community of Reform Jews in college at that point, I don't even know how much people identify with those movements when they come to school now at all, but it really was not a place I wanted to be. And I just I think very quickly kind of got involved and said, well, maybe there's a way I could actually just improve this, like literally create the kind of service that I had experienced at summer camp that made me feel joyful and belonging and happy and where I wanted to be on a Friday night. My mom is a challah genius. When you grew up in Colorado, you can't buy challah. So by necessity, she just became literally like a master. She still is. My mom is 81. She still makes the challah for the entire family. And when I was a freshman in college, I would go home for break and she would make as many as I could possibly carry. And I would freeze them and store them in the freezers all over the quad, like where the dorms were my freshman year. And the idea was, I would have the challah. And so I could have friends come and join me in my dorm room, right? Like we could go to the services or not, and I could create the services or not, but I could also start creating community in my dorm room because I had the precious golden genius challah. And so I think that was kind of joining the mainstream and trying to make an improvement there, but also creating an alternative that was totally enriching and fun for me. So I think that was a big piece. The other thing I would say is my family moved from Colorado to Louisiana, and there was a man named David Duke who was a former Klansman. I don't know if you can be former, but he was considered former Klansman, and he literally ran for office in Louisiana and then U.S. Senate. And I was like the Jew from Louisiana on campus, even though I wasn't really the Jew from Louisiana, but that's what my light driver's license said. And the Hillel rabbi there, Jim Diamond, may his memory be for a blessing, said, Aliza, I think that maybe you want to take the stage. Like there was a whole demonstration on campus. Thank God. It was like, kind of a rising of awareness and activism. And I wrote a speech and stood up on the stage and talked about why David Duke running was, an issue for those of us in St. Louis, Missouri, even though he was in Louisiana, and just what that meant and what it meant for me as a Jew to stand up there. And I think my goal then was to make sure that we were bridging all the student activists on campus who were caring so deeply about social issues in front of them at the time and integrating that also with, for me, my Jewish identity and practice. Like the two felt very interconnected and inspired each other.
So in 2014, you start OneTable. Why don't you tell us more about that? What inspired that? Why Shabbat of all things? Take us into that mindset and thought process.
Yeah, I think it is of all things. I think it is all things. It's a good frame. Can you just imagine your life without Shabbat just for a second? No. How do you keep breathing? The world wouldn't keep breathing. So in fact, that's the way the Genesis story goes. Like God couldn't keep breathing without Shabbat. Like it's it, it is the core of everything. But that's also my own theology. So maybe I'll just break up a little bit in terms of actually the tactics of starting something. So in late 2013, 2014, I was actually approached by two kind of mega American Jewish philanthropies who in part were frustrated by what they saw as kind of a cliff with the birthright investment. People like you had a magnificent transformative experience on birthright. And then there wasn't kind of a natural extension. And there were some really impressive experiments done within Birthright to continue doing programming called Birthright Next. They tried a lot of different things. The piece that they tried the most, that was most successful, was actually helping people make Shabbat. It's just interesting how much of it comes from, Birthright was by far the largest scaled solution for young adult connection and engagement. And all of those people are experiencing Shabbat, sometimes for the very first time on the trip. And it's a 10-day trip, so sometimes 2 Shabbatot. And so we know from all of this research that was often a high point of the trip, or it was a missed opportunity. So that was like one bit of the motivation for philanthropists who are like, we poured tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars into this birth rate experience, and then nothing. Like, what do we do about that? So that was kind of their concern. My concern was actually kind of an interesting compliment. There were two things that became really apparent right away. One was there continue to be Jewish population studies. We are obsessed with studying ourselves. And so the population study that had just come out in, I think it was 2012 by the Pew study, that was when they were starting to talk about the nuns meaning None, people of no religion. And the data showed that millennials at that point, so those were anybody who kind of was born between 81 and 96, they were disassociating from Jewish life, from Israel, from religion at higher rates than other generations at that same stage of life, right? It's common to not associate with a mainstream religion when you are in your 20s, or institutions anyway. But this was really different than other generations. It was much higher, which means to me that the traditional Jewish channels of engagement were not working. So therefore we needed a new one. And the other is that there was an epidemic of loneliness. This is way before COVID. But at that point, young adults were reporting the same levels of social isolation and loneliness as homebound seniors. It's insane, right? We can talk about whether it's an addiction to technology, whether it's about kind of living parallel lives, whether it's about the discomfort in inviting each other and getting to know each other in small groups. Like we can unpack all kinds of reasons, but it's extremely difficult to ask for help when you feel lonely and isolated. And they're not going, and synagogues are great solutions, and so are community centers for community building, but that they're not going into them. So with those two, I think like really charged challenges, how do you create a solution that enables people to come together, form community, feel tied to the Jewish community? So the Jewish community is a reason to come together, so that you're meeting the needs of the people for whom you're designing. So the motivation to work with this particular age group came from these philanthropists, in all honesty. Once it was in my hands, the question was, well, what do people in this stage of life need? What are they looking for? What are they hungry for? And what are their pain points? Where are they like getting stuck? And so the design for OneTable brings Shabbat dinner into the hands of participants, young adults, empowering, giving permission to create their own with all the support that they need, because we can then unpack the ritual, right? So first is like, what do people need? And people aren't saying, I need Shabbat. Shabbat becomes an answer to what they do need, which is connection, which is a permission to take a breath and slow down, which is a sense of grounding, a sense of tie to your roots that is actually good, something that you can share with others. So many of us have beloveds who do not come from a Jewish background at all. Shabbat is something you can actually share with them that feels good. Also, challah. I mentioned my mom's challah. Like, everybody should have my mother's challah. And if you can't have my mother's challah, I'll teach you how to make challah. Like, challah is gold. Everybody can share it. We do a loaf and you pull it apart. I mean, come on. So the Jewish value, the opportunity, the joy connected was incredibly powerful. And then the design question is, well, how do we help people do it? Because if it's so good, how come most people don't do it? And there's a lot of things in our life that are so good, like sleeping 8 hours a night, that a lot of people don't do. So there's a lot of creative solutions to understand those barriers. And that was really the genesis of designing OneTable, is trying to figure out if we could understand what those barriers were and then design solutions to them.
And so can you take us into the model? Like, how does it work?
Yeah.
I go to OneTable, your website, take me through the sort of customer journey, if you will.
Great. So with the notion, again, partly because of our philanthropist starts, who are big thinkers, they're thinking about birth rate scale, like entire generation. You want to design a model from the beginning that can be exponential, right? If it's 1x, if I just have Josh over to my house for Shabbat dinner, we're gonna have a really lovely experience, but the maximum number of I can do those is 52 in a year, right? So I instead want to put the power in Josh's hands so that he can invite Sam, and then Sam can invite Sally, and Sally can invite, right, so on. So the idea was design a solution from the beginning that can grow exponentially, which means you need as many people hosting as possible. which means you need to recruit and support as many young adults who look and experience life as differently as possible, because that's how you actually reach their networks and connections. So there were two things that happened when we first got started. Three things, I would say. The first was, doing a lot of research to understand what are people doing on Friday nights and what's getting in their way. The second was starting to experiment right away. We hired what's like a community manager, following like the way tech companies were also having community managers. Like Airbnb generated this model, WeWork has this model. We're like, great, if it works for them. And that's basically meaning forging connections in real life among your users. So that became an interesting model. It's different from, like, our field staff don't host large dinners for you to attend. They find you, empower you, and help you host the dinners. So it's a different way of evaluating success. And the third was we studied all of the existing social dining platforms. So that's just basically, think about like the way Airbnb works for, you have a host who opens up their home and a guest who finds the home that is the right thing for them for that day or weekend. So social dining platforms were basically that same approach, but for eating. And in 2014, there were a number of startups that were trying to disrupt the dining industry. One of the prominent ones, actually, an Israeli company called Eat With. And it was a brilliant concept where they would find, professional and paraprofessional chefs who would prepare a meal in their home. And then you and your friend or your date or whoever would go, instead of going to a restaurant, you'd go to that person's home. And it's a beautiful vision for creating community. And like, well, that's very close with what we want to do for Shabbat. So we talked to every CEO of every social dining platform that would like answer our calls. And most said no thank you to letting us prototype, but we found one, Noah Karish, who is a Jewish kid. He ran a company called Feastly, because at that point, everything had an LY at the end. And he's like, God, I never know how many people are coming for Shabbat. That'd be great. Let's try this. So we used a technology platform. So Josh, I have a young field manager whose their job is to like go out and recruit those first hosts. And they meet Josh. Josh seems charismatic, really friendly. He's a good connector. So Josh, what do you need from us? So Josh comes, we invite Josh to create a profile on the platform, tells us a little bit about himself, what Shabbat means to him, who he's kind of interested in hosting, how he might design a meal in terms of the food. The question I want Josh to think about is how will his guests feel at the end of the night? So I'm going to help you craft an experience that is worthy of Jewish philanthropic investment, and is actually going to build really beautiful community. Turns out, by the way, that you or other hosts might be like insecure about your home. You might not have the cash it takes to serve 10 people. You might have totally forgotten any of the blessings, or really actually be uncomfortable with the God language, whatever. Like, there's all kinds of barriers that you might have. So in addition to technology, we have something called nourishment support, which is basically $10 per seat of your guests that you can claim through online credit, because again, it has to be scalable, that you can use for groceries, prepared foods, wine glasses. Some people have gotten a table. Like, what are the barriers that would just make it a whole lot easier for you to actually host? So we provide the nourishment. We provide kind of one-on-one Shabbat coaching. We have a whole set of resources for a Shabbat that's connected to, it's Purim. So people are thinking about Purim right now, but there's also, there could be thinking about, Black History Month and how that might connect that to a Solidarity Shabbat. Like, what is happening in the world right now that might help you lead an even more meaningful Shabbat. So we have a lot of resources that are matched up. You post your meal, we have prompts, and we actually have required minimums. So Josh, you have to use at least 150 characters to describe your dinner. Why? Because I actually want you to think about your kavanah, your intention. And also I want your potential guests to know what they're coming into. Then the guest gets to sign up on the platform. And every time you have a guest sign up, that's going to unleash another $10 of nourishment for you. So there's an incentive for you to use the platform. It also helps you organize your meal. And then I can also say to that guest, hey, would you like to try hosting? So my staff can watch like from their own dashboard to see who's hosting, who's guesting, and see if we can help people along their journey from that way. That's more or less how it works. And it's worked so far about 70,000 times for about 175,000 people in 450 cities.
Amazing.
Yeah.
What is one thing that you thought about this construct before you ultimately launched it that you either no longer believe to be true or realized it was something completely different than what you originally thought?
So such a great question. As an entrepreneur, I'm very risk tolerant, and there's a lot of things that have changed over the years. One of the most interesting ones is actually as a result of COVID, just changed things radically. So we had a minimum number of people to have at a dinner. So it turns out, according to lots of science, that 8 people is your ideal dinner party. It's great for conversation. You have people that you know, people you don't know. You can really form relationships. You put your most boisterous person in the middle of the table. Like there's all, you want shared family meal, so, style, all this stuff. And so we set up a minimum of 5 people for every meal. And we would, nourish up to 10, and we would kind of try and encourage people to get to that sweet spot of 8. And in fact, a lot of people hosted meals that were 12 to 14 people kind of crammed into their places. And it was very typical for folks in their earlier 20s, was like as many people as possible at my dinner. When you got into your late 20s and into your 30s, it was much more likely to have that 6 to 8 people much more comfortably, and you'd sit down for dinner and that was your whole night. It's not like you're going out after. I don't know if this sounds familiar, but it's pretty ubiquitous. It's kind of amazing when the data is exactly, follows these patterns. But when COVID hit, we had a lot of people by themselves, like in isolation. And on March 12th, 2020, we're like, shit, if people are required to have at least 5 people to a Shabbat dinner, then the 250 dinners that we have planned this week have to be canceled. And we shifted the minimum from 5 to 1. And so crazy things happen, right? So we really want to, like, if you are totally by yourself, you really should be able to still set a beautiful Shabbat dinner table and feel connected to the people. You may be someone who uses technology. You could go to Izzy and download something beautiful and feel connected. You might FaceTime a friend, but you also might not use technology on Shabbat. And we also think that that's okay. So how do you actually create a very meaningful experience in isolation? And how do we see you? And how can you, as a solo person, individual, still feel seen and part of a community, even though you're literally by yourself? That was a huge change. And we have now had, I think, about 5,000 solo dinners, right? Somebody who's like, I am by myself because of circumstance, and I have to be, and I'm doing this. And now we have people who are saying, I'm actually 3 out of the 4 weeks, I am at a dinner with 15 people, 20 people. I'm like, it's a huge part of my life. But on the 4th, I'm just exhausted, and I'm using Shabbat to restore myself. And thank you for seeing me, OneTable. What? It's like that's like one fascinating example. And by lowering the minimum to hosting, if you host 2 or 3 other people, that's still a pretty good experience. Like, we should have that. I think that initially we set the minimum at 8 because of that whole dinner party stat. And then we had somebody say, I only have 5 people coming. I guess I should cancel. I'm like, oh, no. Like, don't cancel Shabbat. We need to shift, not you. So that was one example of just like trying to understand the way people are actually behaving and whether the structures you set are actually supporting them in that way. So that's one example. I mean, there's many, but that's what I could think of top of mind.
Amazing. And I want to know, without asking you to name any names, OneTable seems to me to be quite innovative in how you were able to address and serve a market of people that maybe didn't even realize that they wanted what you're offering.
Yeah.
How has the sort of traditional institutional Jewish ecosystem received and perceived OneTable? I'm curious to know.
Yeah, I would say it took a while. So I would say that like our initial funders are also somewhat considered renegades. So, so I can answer it from a couple places. At this point, OneTable engages about 50,000 people a year. We white label our technology for other Jewish organizations, including pretty mainstream ones like Hillel. And we're generating at least $8 million of revenue a year, mostly through donations. And a lot of those donations come from federations and family foundations. And so that's pretty darn mainstream, right? Like, that's about as big of a kind of a hechsher, I would say, from the mainstream Jewish community as you can get. Where we get concern, resistance, comes from a discomfort with this kind of peer learning model, is what I would say. Meaning, there'll be people who'll say that this is it's not a valid enough Jewish experience because there is no educator. Like, what if Josh fumbles the Kiddush, or what if he doesn't do it at all? Is that still a Shabbat dinner? It's not a concern that I personally carry. I think that reason that OneTable is as successful as we are is twofold. One, we are human-centered in our design. If our target population is shifting, we need to shift to meet their needs just constantly. And the second is fundamentally, we believe in the end user, right? Like, I trust you. You have permission to create this experience in a way that works for you. I don't need to be there to judge it. I want to support it. And no one would say fundamentally that they disagree with that, like that's bad for the Jews, but there are people who are really terrified by it. And so I would say, like, the rejections that we get from philanthropic support or from certain partnerships will be like, oh, it's not Jewish enough. That it's just, some people will say it's just Shabbat dinner. And I just like, can we just unpack the word just there? Like, what the hell do you mean just Shabbat dinner?
I think what's interesting, and this is something that I feel that I'm up against as well, is that, you know, some parts of the Jewish world are more interested in the Jewish than in the world. Yeah. And when I say that, I mean product market fit, right? I mean, just because a certain group of small group of individuals that might have a lot of money decide that they want to see something in the world doesn't mean that the world wants it. The world needs it. The world's going to receive it. The world's going to use it. And I think that's a sorely missing piece in the Jewish world. I think what you're doing is quite refreshing because it's different. And you're basically saying, listen, we're studying the user, just like a high-tech company, and we're giving them what they want, and we're allowing them to have the experience that they want, not the experience that a small group of people want them to have. How do you respond to that kind of thing?
Yeah, look, so I see my role often as translator, right? So, and it's actually very interesting because when I started OneTable, I was already pretty far out of our target demographic. In multiple ways. I've had Shabbat dinner every single week my entire life. Like, there's just never been a Friday where I haven't marked Shabbat in some way. So what does it mean for me to have empathy for someone who like really didn't grow up with it, or is brand new to it, or is trying to make it their own? And also I had 3 kids. I was like just at a totally different stage of life in early my 40s when I started this. So I think it probably helped in a sense that I could, because of where I was in life, I could be trusted to speak to the kind of philanthropic class in that way about the experience of young adults. Like, I was positioned to be that kind of midpoint translator, but I needed immediately to also gain that empathy and hire market folks who we hired 10 observers to go out and understand what's happening on the ground. And it's my job to translate to the philanthropists what's actually happening on the ground, and then also translate the concerns and the passions of the philanthropists into something that actually can be effective, right? So we get in our own way all the time. And I'll just say what I'm talking about is incredibly hard and exhausting. Like, it would be easy if we all spoke the same language. We all like immediately valued the same things. But I think fundamentally, everybody wants what they have for others, right? They're like, I love this. I love Israel. I want everybody to love Israel. I love challah. I really do love challah. And I really want everybody to love it. And if you're totally gluten-free, like, we have to have a whole conversation about like how to adapt the ritual for you. The question is, how much can we practice hitlamdut, right? Curiosity. And that's my role. Like, how can I be super curious about what's behind the desire of the philanthropist who tends to use the word should, which is like the curse word for those of us who do design, right? Because should is imposing one value onto the other, right? And you will hear often about how young people should XYZ, right? I mean, it doesn't work. And if we can keep saying it's right, but those solutions weren't working, or I understand that assumption, I understand that fear, that concern that because of intermarriage, the people's going to dissolve, or because of the lack of, there's maybe a lack of fluency or a lack of competence in certain knowledge and ritual. And I understand that fear from you. And here is what I'm hearing about what is deeply meaningful. So if I cannot successfully navigate both worlds and translate, then I'm going to fail for sure. And the funder doesn't actually want to fail. They want to succeed. But it's really hard. I think there's probably a good number of people who might not have succeeded in my work or still be here. And it's an interesting question as to, for me or for other professionals who have been able to take an initial vision that started with one particular, like there was definitely like, birthright failed in follow-up. That was a motivation. That does not motivate me. What motivates me is the potential for deep, meaningful social and religious connection for young adults. That's inspiring to me. So how do I marry those two? And I think that they can be married, but it takes a lot of relationship and time and curiosity all over the place.
One of the other big challenges that I'm curious to hear what you think about is scale, from the standpoint of how do we scale great Jewish leaders like yourself, right? Because there's a clear lack of Jewish leadership, maybe in the like ultra Orthodox or even Orthodox world, where the rabbis, in that world, I think there's some probably what I would call pretty good leadership. And the way I define leadership, by the way, for the sake of this conversation, is not people that are in a position of power, rather people that have a large amount of people who want to follow that individual and then become leaders in and of themselves and create their own followers and create that sort of network effect. How do we scale the next great Jewish leaders?
Great question. I mean, I feel like it probably comes from two different directions, Josh. One is like, whenever I'm speaking in anything, I should probably have another person right next to me, right? Like, I was there's a different podcast called Judaism Unbound, which was started by a friend and colleague, Dan Liebenson. And I was one of the first interviews when he was just first getting it started, because yes, I'm going to say yes to him. Absolutely. I was just listening to this morning that two of my staff were being interviewed by him. They're in their early 20s. They were talking about food and connection. They can speak very fluently about it. And so they are, it's already their voice. They have the microphone right now. So it's an interesting question. It's about how are people like me held to account to make sure I'm sharing the microphone? And helping identify people like, ooh, that is a great voice. Ooh, I love that. And, and actually maybe even judging my own success by how many other people I am lifting up. But that's top down. Then the question is bottom up, right? Which is so interesting. We can unpack your own story, Josh. You're like, I need a microphone. What do I need to get this voice out, right? There are tools that are so much more accessible. I have a master's degree. The people that I see kind of flourishing nowadays don't necessarily come from a master's degree. They're seeing issues and troubles and opportunities. I was just, Miriam Anzovin was just featured in a lot of different places. She's been putting out a Daf Yomi, like a Talmud teaching, right, on TikTok. Brilliant. She's doing a great job, and on Instagram. And, she's a rabbinical student, right? So she doesn't yet have positional power, but she knows how to pay attention to channels, and the channels keep changing. So I think it's also, I think it's hard to not think about this from my own perspective. I'll go back to my own perspective for 1 second, which is it's on me to pay attention to new channels and new voices coming up and figuring out how to, sort of see and value that. There's a lot of that should piece. People get so uncomfortable with social media as a valued way of communicating or connecting with people. But if you ask young people, no, that is how I feel connected, especially in the past couple of years. So it's also kind of giving respect to new ways of communicating. There are endless fellowships out there. In the Jewish community, we have almost every family foundation often has a fellowship that they support, right? Hillel has fellowships. I was a Hillel fellow, right? That same rabbi who put me on the microphone to speak about David Duke nominated me for a 1-year fellowship at Hillel International, and it changed my whole career path because of it, right? So I was invested in that way. And what's interesting about that is it was, again, sort of both directions, right? I stood up, I went in, I made it clear that I cared, but Rabbi Jim Diamond saw me and gave me the microphone. So I feel like there's a lot of making that making that space. But there is something to me about judging your success with how many others you have empowered.
Absolutely. Do you find, in my experience, I don't find that to be common. I don't find that maybe more of the institutional organizations, the so-called leaders of them, are not fond of younger, next generation type of people. You see turnover very, very low in the executive management of institutional Jewish organizations. So it's a two-way street, as you said, and so we have to have people that are willing to step up and come into the arena, but we also need our so-called leaders and people in positions of power and influence to welcome us into the arena as well.
Totally.
How do we create a more conducive environment like that?
Look, so we are probably every moment in history feels this way, but in my experience, I've been in executive leadership now in the Jewish community from a tiny little startup that I helped build, that is now a national, international model for a mikveh and education center. It's called Mayyim Hayyim in Boston. Now, I'm in my 9th year at OneTable, and before then, I did all kinds of interesting things in different startups and playing different roles in them. So I've been in the field for a long time. I think that we're in a transitional period, and then transitional meaning the voices of millennial and Gen Z professionals coming in, whether they're coming in as volunteers, coming in as donors, coming in as professionals, expectations of the leadership from them is different than my expectations. I worked for Richard Joel when he was at Hillel International, and there was I disagreed vehemently with him on the inclusion of LGBTQ, both, sort of students and Hillel professionals. And the question was, I was so careful about trying to figure out how to navigate, how to elevate, how to speak his language, how to modify. I did not come in with a demand. There is a shift now in terms of like what's expected of me as a CEO. Whether it was, I'm an American, right? So when George Floyd was murdered, the need for OneTable to take a stance towards being anti-racist. What did that mean? OneTable is a Shabbat organization, right? There's no opportunity to say, I'm sorry, we don't deal with social issues here. Like there's a magnificent research article that MIT just put out, which is about kind of activist employees, and understand. I'm saying all of this because the sort of the new generation of people coming in perceive what they want and expect in terms of leadership and recognition and representation is just different. And it's not changing. It's not going to soften, I don't think. And I think there's a lot of fear of screwing up, of getting canceled, from the executive leadership, right? There's not a lot of incentive yet to open up your door as widely as you can. And of course, in this great article, which I'll send the link for, it's not just opening up your door and saying, hey, I have an open door, but actually you have to go to where the people are that you want to engage. I have to go into the meeting where we're going to talk about an article that someone read about harassment and what does that mean for OneTable and what is our policy and how we have to, I think the expectation has been my door is open. You can come and talk to me anytime. And now the clarity, like, no, they're not going to come into your room, even if you're so nice. I think I'm pretty nice, right? But it's not, I still have positional power. So people aren't walking in. I have to go to them. And it is scary. It's scary. A lot of CEOs have been fired somewhat recently by saying stupid asinine things that they probably weren't even thinking about. So I think there is I think we need a whole lot of coaching for executives right now as to okay, let's practice some curiosity. Your job is not at risk. You can have this conversation and get to know this person and not be threatened by their point of view. And also 25-year-olds starting in this job or coming in as a philanthropist here is what top of mind for the CEO who seems to be resistant to you. There was a lot of conversations around polarization right now, a ton. And I think there also needs to be conversation about just sort of intergenerational conversations so that there's greater curiosity and lowers the threat level. Because what are you going to do? Close out the future? It makes no sense whatsoever. But also, you can be in positional power now and be pretty young. like, I think that that also seems different from when I started out, where you really had to put in your time.
Right.
I think the expectations are different now. Also, I gave the Mayyim Hayyim example. Like, she can manipulate social media, or she knows, I shouldn't say manipulate, she can navigate it so fluently, so quickly, and reach tens of thousands more people for a Daf Yomi test than a rabbinical school.
Right. No, it's interesting. I mean, yeah, and I think also when you look at in the for-profit sector, most founders of some of the great companies are probably definitely under 50, probably under 40, maybe even under 30. So yeah, I mean, the barriers to entry are lower. I did speak to one sort of traditional nonprofit executive recently who said basically young people come in, they don't like what they see, they go off and do their own thing. And the tools of doing your own thing today are a lot more accessible.
Yeah.
And access to donors, access to marketing tools, those things didn't exist 10, 20, 30 years ago. So
Yeah.
going off and doing your own thing was kind of, you were sort of isolated. Whereas, today, I mean, the way we started Izzy, I didn't need a big, donor behind me. We're not a nonprofit, but I didn't need
Yeah.
a big person behind me. We were able
Yeah.
to go to market right away, launch a
Yeah.
pre-order, raise a ton of money, start working on our tech. I mean, those things just didn't exist once upon a time. So I want to
There's
ask you.
also, sorry, Josh, the only thing I would just say to that also is that you can start things and they can also fail, and that's not the worst thing in the world.
Right.
And for legacy Jewish institutions, it is the worst thing in the world.
Right.
It is terrifying. Failure is terrifying. They have massive infrastructure, generations of donors, big buildings oftentimes, right? And so whereas, a startup, most startups don't, most startups fail, right? We know this. And those of us who are comfortable startups are pretty risk tolerant. That's by nature, right? Like, let's try it. What's the worst thing that can happen is that we don't get anywhere. The best thing that can happen is amazing. So let's try it. That is not a mentality that, by definition, legacy often can mean risk averse. And I think that is, because it's the longevity that is the value. And this is the conflict of value sometimes.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a really good point of how to describe that sort of dynamic. I want to ask you about the sort of next 10 years of OneTable. How do you see it? Where do you see it going? Based on what you've been able to accomplish basically in the last 10 years or so.
Amazing. So I'm actually in the midst of a strategic planning process. So it's a very good question. It's top of mind, thinking about our aspirational goals. And we also just fielded a pretty intensive impact study that we will be, that we're, kind of pulling apart and looking at all the crosstabs to understand all the point. But I'll say there were, two kind of pretty clear findings. One is it works, right? 75% of OneTable users are practicing Shabbat now, and they wouldn't have otherwise. So I'm like, okay, good. But that's like fundamentally we set out, like, how do we help people do this? We should do more of it because it works. So that's good. And when I say works, I definitely imply a whole lot of iteration constantly. The other thing that came out is that we studied 2,000 OneTable users and 800 in a comparison group. So these are other Jewish young adults who are not involved in OneTable. And they were pretty similar in many, many ways. Except when it came to loneliness and senses of isolation. So we look at the UCLA studies, other scales, like organizations that are particularly expert in social connection, and we take that same scale and we apply it for our users. So we're not like asking our own made up questions about social connection and human flourishing. There were 16 points, which is overwhelming for the researchers when they saw that gap between the OneTable users who have someone to call and have connection, and those who do not, right? The sense, and it's pretty extreme. To me, that is the strongest call to action possible, right? Like the future of Jewish life relies on people, being here in the most fundamental way, like living and flourishing and connecting. So an emphasis on human flourishing and living and connecting, to me, is at the core of everything. And the data to me says, like, holy cow, we need to get lots more people doing this. So on the one hand, it's just straight up reaching more people. There's, right now we're only US based. There's somewhere between 1 and 1.4 million young adults in our kind of target, our total addressable market. What would it look like to get to 10% of those in a year? right? Like that's 140,000 users annually. Well, what kind of infrastructure might it take to do that? And how do we make sure that they don't just come once, but they come repeatedly? So that Shabbat is just ubiquitous, right? It's just what you do, and it's how you connect and feel joy, and you learn it at this stage of life and you do more. So one is just like lots more of what we're doing. Second is we have this new product powered by OneTable, which enables other companies, organizations to leverage the same technology for intimate gatherings, for larger scale gatherings, online, in person. If I fundamentally believe that human connection is at the core of everything, then this technology can enable that at scale. So that can literally, it can 10x our impact in terms of helping other people having nothing to do with Shabbat dinner necessarily connect. Then we also see a third pathway, which is something like an expansion of our brand, like whether it's a OneTable Plus or it's Connect at OneTable. I don't know, making it up as I go along right now, because it's in that initial kind of, it's my favorite stage, right? It's like, what might it be? But basically, how strong is our brand equity? Can OneTable have people way beyond our target population also engaging in the platform, finding connection through Shabbat? So that might start with, empty nesters, for example, who are oftentimes dropping off their Jewish and social connections when their kids leave. Like there's a whole new stage of life happening there. What would it be like? What would it require to actually support people like that? What's the opportunity in terms of intergenerational connections? What should we be enabling and supporting there? I had a board member that is like, I wish we could support every Shabbat dinner in Ukraine right now. Like, right, it's a web-based platform and an app like that could be used for all kinds of places and all kinds of people. What does it look like to take that kind of, that kind of expansion? So I see OneTable being a thought leader in terms of, human-centered design, in terms of making Judaism meaningful and accessible into the hands of the user. I see thinking about, continuing to evolve the technology so it's so delightful to use and people actually want to incorporate it, even though, of course, you can make Shabbat on your own without a platform. Why does this platform actually enhance it and help more of those connections tie? I thought about like meet cute at OneTable, right? Like, there's people are coming out of this pandemic not having been on a date in 2 years. Like, how do we help people, build those social ties and connections? Like, it feels just extremely expansive. On the other sort of side of it is we're partnering with Tiffany Schlane, who focuses on kind of unplugging. Like, can OneTable help people go online to organize their meal and then go offline fully for Shabbat, like fully disconnect? What does that look like? And how does that help with human healing and flourishing? We're partnering with the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, which is thinking about kind of elevating mindfulness practice. Shabbat can carve out a time for you to actually go much deeper in terms of your relationship with the divine. That's a pretty great invitation from my end. We provide nourishment, which is food, right? So how might we do that so that we're not providing just nourishment for Jewish young adults, but for people who are maybe some others who are food insecure, right? We have this platform. How can we leverage it in multiple ways? So I think that I get very excited about yes and in these ways, as you can tell. But I think when you take the next Jewish Pew study, I'd like 50% of people to say, I find Jewish connections through Shabbat. That's how I feel I belong. That's how I connect with others and my tradition. And I'd love OneTable to be, an instigator or catalyst for that kind of at scale impact.
I'm curious to know, my feeling is that the easiest way to defeat anti-Semitism is to engage non-Jewish people in Jewish ritual, Jewish celebration, Jewish practice of different kinds. For each person, it'll be different based on age, based on demographic, based on places in the world, languages in Israel, outside of Israel, whatever. I'm curious to know, like, for example, I do a lot of Buddhist things in my life or things that originate from Buddhism. Am I a Buddhist? No. Am I going to move to India or a different part of the world where Buddhism is sort of the pretense? Absolutely not. But I still find tremendous value in things like yoga or meditation or mindfulness or, different types of things that, again, originate from Buddhism. Do you see OneTable, for example, as tapping into sort of non-Jewish communities as a way to build the quote unquote Jewish brand and the value that Judaism can bring to non-Jews, not to convert them, not to do anything other than just to provide that interpersonal value that I think Judaism can provide, and therefore do a great job of combating anti-Semitism and building stronger connections with our non-Jewish communities.
So two quick, it's an amazing question. I have two quick answers. One, it's probably not quick, but two answers. One is, and I forgot to mention this, we've actually, we're working on a proposal to the John C. Templeton Foundation, which is not a Jewish foundation. They are, but they are a foundation that supports the cross-section between religion and science and behavior, and they're very invested in what is the next yoga, actually, right? So thinking about how, you know, yoga comes from a religious practice, but it's become ubiquitous with living well, right? With balance. And people need this, man. And you can practice yoga by yourself or in a studio, or in this, we could do it with heat, with clothes and whatever. You have like many gajillions of options, but it's the same language. And the question is like, what's the next yoga? And they've asked us to submit a study to say like, what's the connection between Shabbat dinner specifically and human flourishing, so that it could potentially introduce Shabbat as this gift and this access, whether it's a family, you know, a shared family meal or a meal shared with like the anchor of the sanctity of time. The kind of the mitzvah of Shabbat is that you don't have to decide when to have this powerful moment to stop. It's like, it's bigger than you are. And so that you get to kind of yield to it. Like there's a lot of that pieces that I think that Shabbat can absolutely be an invitation way beyond the Jewish community. And I fully agree with you that, you know, the more our brothers and sisters and siblings who come from different backgrounds, for whom Jews and Jewish life is foreign, the best thing possible is to be in relationship, right? I have been to an iftar dinner, right, which is the break fast during Ramadan. That's the best way for me to understand Muslim traditions in Queens, New York, right? So what's the exchange to that? I think Shabbat dinner and the OneTable platform should absolutely be used by that. We had conversations with some European partners a few years ago, thinking about what would it look like, you know, just to have community amongst European Jews who are struggling. What would it look like for European Jews to host Jews who are traveling from all over the world at their Shabbat dinners? And then the bigger question came, well, what if those same dinners were open to their neighbors, right? They were, you know, whether they were Polish or French or Spanish, who were not Jewish, but would come into someone's home for Shabbat dinner, might that address anti-Semitism, right? Because it's not just the ritual that they're experiencing, but relationship. And breaking bread is the quickest way, it's been scientifically demonstrated and proven, it is the quickest way to forge relationships. And that just brings us back to challah. See how it all comes back?
Amazing. Well, Aliza, it was really a pleasure to speak with you and to learn from you. And thank you for doing this.
Bekef. Thank you for inviting me.